Of all the presentations on this formation series that we're giving, this is the most indirect about Mary. But let me ask you this. Have we learned a little bit about Mary and her world? Yes or no?
Yes.
What have we learned about the Blessed Mother?
She would have been a pariah at that time.
And by extension, her son too, right? Already it was bad. St. Joseph was one of the ergotai. If he was an artisan, a construction worker, badly translated carpenter, he would have had to travel to different villages. People who traveled in this world, anywhere in the Mediterranean world, in the ancient world, anywhere in antiquity, were considered social deviants. Yeah.
The early writers of the Gospels included a lot of shameful things about Mary. And their aim in many ways, and other things that they wrote, was to honor Christ and honor the Father.
Yeah.
So
and honor her too.
It had the virgin conception had to be true, or they wouldn't have included it. It was too shameful.
That Mary was found pregnant before she was living with her husband was true. Why would the church invent that? By the criterion of embarrassment, we can see not only is this a true story, like Medusa, it's also historical. It happened. But I want you to think about then how Jesus would have been. Do you imagine Jesus to be an A student? There's no schools in Nazareth. Do you imagine him to be like the most respected, student? That there's a little synagogue in Nazareth and Jesus is just the one beaming and everybody. If you imagine that to be Jesus, you have to wonder why they even crucified him. Who would crucify such a kid?
Some people say that he went to school in Egypt, so it wasn't true.
There are no schools in ancient Galilee. And temple is the primarily economic. It's like more Wall Street than the Vatican. It's the economic gathering point for all Israelite money and commerce in the first century. It's the economic gathering point of the region. And who controls that? The elites. Right? You first have Herod. You also have Pilate, but he's over at Caesarea Maritima. You have Herod and his family, the Herodians. How do they live? Do they look like Israelites? They live like Greco-Romans. They speak Greek mostly, maybe some Aramaic, none Hebrew. Then you got the Sadducees, who are mostly from their family, right? And do you think the Sadducees look like the way Mel Gibson makes Caiaphas look? No way, they'd be looking like Greco-Romans. Yeah.
Sirach holds a lot of really rich information about the culture.
Sirach, absolutely. Ben Sira holds a lot of rich information about the culture.
How come you don't find it in a Protestant Bible?
That's a very good question. Why? Martin Luther, and he meant well, tried to go back to original sources instead of going to Latin Vulgate, let's try to go back to earlier texts. Other Protestants go back to the Masoretic texts. They thought those ancient Hebrew texts were the most ancient and therefore the closest in relationship to the Apostolic Fathers, who they considered to be, at the time, Israel. They knew to be Israelites, but they considered to be Jewish, the same kind of beliefs. What we've discovered with the Dead Sea Scrolls and with the finds at Nag Hammadi in Oxyrhynchus, actually, Upper Egypt, and other things, is that in the Codex Sinaiticus, is that there were actually many different translations of scriptures. And the one that the earliest Jesus groups actually followed tended to be the Greek versions, especially in the communities that Paul founded in the Mediterranean world. And those texts had the 7 deuterocanonical books in the Old Testament, including 1 and 2 Maccabees and Sirach. Sirach also was the most quoted book by the Old Testament book in the first centuries of the church, because it was a compendium of all the wisdom of Israel. And remember, the first Jesus groups were Israelites. They identified as Israelites for a long time. So when you begin to think about these things, see, and I could go on and on, you see how much baggage we have when we come to these stories. So I want to continue with you these wonderful adventures. Next month, I believe it is April 24th, we're going to begin Mariology. What I've tried to give you this with the first two sessions is a kind of starting point so that we can maybe defragment some things and look at some things a little differently. And then we're going to see how the church begins to appreciate and understand Mary from the picture of Mary we receive in Luke and in John, and this mysterious woman in the book of Revelation, plus Paul's own understanding of the church as a bride. As a bride. And then looking at ecclesiology develop, we begin to see Mariology develop. So we're going to look at the first few centuries, and we're going to tackle this idea about the virginity of Mary, the perpetual virginity of Mary, and why that's been important for the church, and how that understanding was passed along.
The ideas of adoption into the Christian faith.
Yeah. Adoption of the Christian faith, yes, exactly.
And becoming a family and part of that holy family.
And how Mary becomes this perfect symbol for the church. That's going to take us at least 3 sessions. Mariology begins, Mary the first 1,000 years, Mary the second 1,000 years. As we move through the summer, we're going to get to the Assumption, the dogmas of Mary, and then eventually we're going to talk about what a proper Mariology is, what a proper Marian devotion is. Any questions, final points? Yes, Richard. Oh, okay. 9:09, I'm holding you guys late, sorry. Okay, let's stand for prayer.